Hi, everyone. I'm Derek Chollet here at the German Marshall Fund, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this morning's book talk with Peter Singer, who's the co-author of the terrific new novel, Burn In. He's co-written it with August Cole, Burn In, a novel of the Real Robotic Revolution. And I'm thrilled to be joined this morning by my colleague, Lindsay Gorman, who's an emerging technology fellow at the Alliance for Securing Democracy here at GMF. Uh, Pete has co-authored this terrific novel, which probably a year ago, 6 months ago, it would have been read as a techno-thriller about a future that is not yet here. But I think events since he's written this book and since it's been published has made it all too prescient. And I look forward to having a conversation with Peter and with Lindsay about the ideas and the themes of this book. Before we start our conversation with Peter, we're going to have a brief intro video that helps set up the book. So let's start with that. Well, I have to say that video in 1 minute gives you many of the kind of emotions and feelings that you have when reading this book. It's an intense read, it's a thrilling read, and it's a very provoking read. So, Peter, thanks for writing it. I should say, by way of introduction, many of you know Peter Singer, but he's a widely acclaimed author for many years, has been on the forefront of writing and thinking about the future of the military technology and the way that it's reshaping not just the way we fight wars, but it's very clear in this book the way our societies operate. Peter is a strategist at the New America Foundation and a professor at Arizona State University. And this is his second novel. The first one, also co-written with August Cole, was called Ghost Fleet, which is a widely acclaimed book about the future of warfare. So, Peter, thanks for joining us. It's great to have you. Looking forward to the discussion with Lindsay. Lindsay, thanks for joining us as well. Just to kick things off, and by way of introduction, so the title Burn In, I think explain to our listeners why the title, what it means, what you were hoping to try to convey with the title, and then also recognizing that it's a thriller, and I don't want to spoil the ride for any of our future readers here, but give us a sense of the general plot lines and what you were trying to do with this story.
Sure. So first, let me begin by thanking you for those, incredibly kind words, and also everybody at the organization for putting together this event. I know it's not easy doing everything remote, but really appreciate it. So Burn In, a novel of the Real Robotic Revolution. As you hit, the title is packed with multiple meanings. A burn-in is a engineering term for when you deliberately push a technology in order to learn from it, including to learn from its failure. So for example, when you take a new watch underwater to see, how deep can I take it before it cracks? And so that is in the story, there's a burn-in going on of AI, of robotics. but it's also a symbolic of how it feels like we're performing a burn-in on society writ large. In the real world, we're sort of, continually pushing things maybe to the breaking point. But then there's finally the idea of what the book itself is. The book is a test of, in a sense, a new form. So Burn-In is, as you mentioned, it's a novel, it's a technothriller, but it's smashed up with nonfiction. So it was a multi-year nonfiction research project on what are the planned applications of AI, robotics, Internet of Things, and then in turn, what are some of the dilemmas and issues that are going to come out of it in the real world? And so, it has a plot. We follow a set of characters through the streets of a future Washington, D.C., the hunt for a terrorist. But baked into the story are over 300 real world lessons, applications, predictions, everything from, okay, how does AI actually work? What is a neural net? What's something like algorithmic bias? To, what are Amazon's plans for delivery drones? You name it. There's 300 of these baked into the story. And then just like a nonfiction reporter book, it actually has the little number at the end of the sentence that takes you to the research endnote. So, for wonks like you and I, we may go to those and we'll go, okay, I want to validate that this is real. So, oh, here's Amazon's patent for it, or here's the report by someone like Lindsay on that goes deeper into this issue that we just portrayed in a scene. And the idea of this burn-in is that we're using the format of a novel to package information, complex ideas in a manner that's going to stick with people and be more likely to read both by the public but also policymakers. Kind of in shorthand, you and I are parents. It's like sneaking fruit and veggies into the morning smoothie, except in this case, it's for it's instead of the PowerPoint or the white paper, it's a novel, and we can talk further about sort of why of that. And then finally, the subtitle, Real Robotic Revolution. It's basically, real quickly, and we can talk about this further, is that we're on the 100-year anniversary of the creation of the word robot, and it's always been this narrative of mechanical servant that wises up and then rises up. And that discourse is not just in sci-fi, the Terminator movies or the like, or that first play back in 1920, RUR, but it's also hit our policy world. We spend so much time talking about killer robots, and we have research programs on it. We see it in Pentagon policy discussions. It's talked about at the UN. And yet the reality is, what you and I are living through and what we're going to have to deal with is not a robot revolt. It's a robotics revolution. It's an industrial revolution. And that, of course, hits everything. It hits geopolitics. It hits domestic politics. It hits your family life. It hits business strategy. And so, it's sort of a shorthanded way of saying we're going after it in much in the wrong way. We want to paint a different vision, which we believe the research shows is a more realistic vision, ironically enough.
Well, there's a lot of things I'd like to follow up with you in the course of this discussion, but I'd like to bring in my colleague, Lindsay Gorman. Again, Lindsay is an emerging technology fellow here at the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund. And Lindsay's thought deeply about many of these technologies and the policy implications. I'm not sure if this is the first techno-thriller that's been aligned with your work, Lindsay, that you've had to comment on, but I'm very curious in your reactions to the book, what struck you the most, what worried you the most, what you thought was the most accurate, and the policy issues that it raised. So Lindsay, over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Derek, for the invitation to really dig into this book and talk with you and Peter about some of the substance of it. It is actually not my first thriller that's related to my work. Before joining GMF, I was doing a lot of research on unmanned systems from the military side, and so I had the pleasure of reading Ghost Fleet, which I enjoyed immensely to promote another one of Peter's excellent works. So it was a real pleasure to dig into this. And I think as researchers and scholars, we're always trying to think of ways, especially when it comes to these very, very technical topics, to communicate to a broader audience and raise awareness on what are the threats that as a society we could be facing, to get this kind of outside the DC policy bubble and really appeal to a wider audience. And I think that's something that this book does so well, in that it's really able to bring in kind of these elements of very technical geekery. And as a computer scientist and physicist sort of by background, I've learned a lot of this stuff from the textbooks, and it there are so many examples where I thought, oh wow, that's a great way of communicating it to someone who maybe did not study public key cryptography in college, but just a couple of examples on. There's a discussion of cryptography with an Alice and a Bob and an intruder, which really is very consistent with what we learn in computer science. There's some interesting discussion of digital authenticity and deep fakes. I think one of the interesting parts for me was seeing, as you mentioned, Derek, what in this future scenario is a reality and what is not. And I was encouraged to see that, at least in the world of burn-in, we figured out how to verify authenticity online and check for deep fakes. And I think there are sort of a couple themes to answer your question on sort of what struck me about this that I think are really worth digging into. One of which, as I was reading it, I was trying to figure out sort of where are we in time? How much has happened technologically? How much have we advanced? We have discussions about 5G in this book. We have the deep fakes. We have unmanned aerial systems jamming communications. So much of this is really in the realm of possibility. And one sort of the first theme that struck me is there's almost sort of a plus ça change element of this, that despite all these technical advances, in the book, we've automated away the legal system. The main character's husband, if I'm not giving too much away, has lost his job due to automation. He's a Yale law grad, and he's out of a job, and he's doing a virtual reality assistance to the elderly. And so it seems like, we've almost completely automated away the legal system, yet DC traffic remains an issue, and the sort of bureaucratic red tape persists. And I don't know if this was an intended commentary on Peter and August's part, but it might be reflective of our current priorities. I'm thinking back to sort of the start of the Joint Artificial Intelligence Center at the Pentagon, when the first mission they went after was analyzing drone footage in a way that really pissed off Silicon Valley a little bit. And when at the time the Pentagon hadn't been able to be audited, and there were so many sort of back office processes that AI can really help with, that I think we still have not really harnessed. So that was sort of an interesting kind of theme in the book, and I think it's perhaps also partially explainable by this intermediate stage that the book tries to capture between, this promise of a strong AI where the robots have taken over, and sort of more where we are today. And so that's why I think, human machine teaming is really at the center of this relationship between the lead character and her robot. Autonomous vehicles are there, but it seems like not everyone's using them, and maybe that contributes to all this traffic. So we're at this sort of friction point when, as a society, we're figuring out, what role do these robots really have in our lives? What role should they have? A couple other themes, I think, one of them was I found the book to be very deeply dystopian and in some ways depressing, which I think is probably all the more reason that it should be a wake-up call of what could happen. Particularly from the perspective of automation and job loss, it seemed like there was, in this predicted future, job creation from these AI systems really was not an option, and almost all jobs from farming to the Yale law degrees were getting automated away in a way that had sort of depressing impacts on society, and one that also really has, I think, in this book, which is a good prediction of how things can go, really exacerbated inequality. Reading this as a woman, seeing sort of the female lead taking on not only the breadwinning role, but the parenting role and the childcare responsibilities and everything under the sun. You see how these kind of tensions play out. I think, in one example, the authors talk about a pure code movement to try to get a genetic stamp of approval on all code that's produced. So I think it's easy to see how this future without the proper guardrails can really lead to increased economic, racial, and gender inequality in a somewhat disturbing way. And I think sort of the last theme that struck me reading this book is on the issue of data privacy, and particularly in the private sector. This is a future where there is federal privacy legislation, but it really only narrowly limits what the government and what law enforcement can do. It gives very broad parameters to the private sector. And perhaps that contributes to sort of some of this dystopia. There's one example of a kid playing with a toy, of course, an automated, robotic, very sophisticated, parent-controlled toy. One of these nuggets that gets snuck in there is that privacy updates sometimes just happen without you knowing it. I wondered, well, at the same time as these kind of sort of dystopian technologies that are not really very far off are being developed, are we going to see sort of other technologies that are equally powerful trying to counteract that? So maybe an app that will tell you, okay, well, this one app over here actually just did a privacy update without you knowing it. Let's alert you. So I think, that privacy issue and data issue seems really at the center of this. But yeah, I'll stop there. I have some sort of other thoughts on how the sequel could go, but I'll leave it there for now and look forward to the questions.
Excellent. Thanks, Lindsay. And I definitely want to get to your ideas on the sequel, hopefully a more optimistic one. And Peter, I'd like to give you a chance to respond to some of that, but framing it as a question to you, which is, Lindsay talked about the friction points between this future and the technological change that we're seeing, and you say we'll be seeing more of, and the policy issues that presents. And when you set out to write this book, and when you were first sketching out the plot with August, what were the issues that you felt really needed to be presented, and then also why, just as an author, did you think that fiction was going to be the best way to go about getting this debate going?
Those are great question and phenomenal comments. And one of the things Lindsay did is I often talk about how every book has actually underlying themes to it. So Moby Dick is not actually about a hunt for the whale. And what we were trying to accomplish is our underlying themes that seemingly are ones from sci-fi are actually, this is the answer to your question, real world policy questions that we have to figure out. And the fact is that we're not doing a great job at them, in part because we think of them as mere science fiction. So, and I'll get into the themes, but kind of, rapidly, whether it's the question of human machine teaming, that is a real world policy question everywhere from the military doctrine to, I was talking to a group of Wall Street traders, that's what they're trying to figure out, to it hits the issues of how we rethink the American and every education system out there. What is the role of the human? What is the role of the machine? And how does that affect future jobs, you name it? Or, another question that is a theme is the fine line between utopian and dystopian views of the world and the technologies that are being rolled out. And that often one thing that is posed as utopian will be in dystopian in execution and or will be viewed as dystopian by someone who comes from a different point of view in that society. So, a great active example of that right now is face recognition technology. that is, offered up as the solution to so many different problems. And it has, its use in law enforcement, military targeting, health, to its, a profit making for everything. We're seeing everything from advertising and digital marketing companies use it, and platform companies, to Kentucky Fried Chicken had a face recognition program for its customers. Oh, by the way, it's incredibly disturbing if you think about it from other vantage points, right? So there's these sort of, and so to pull back on this, with Ghost Fleet, we sort of walked backward into its policy impact. We did not plan for Ghost Fleet to be so useful. We call it useful fiction. And yet, you and I have known each other for a long time. The hard truth is that Ghost Fleet had greater policy impact than all of my nonfiction books. It was the one that sparked, multiple investigations. It was the one that led to the Navy literally named a $3.6 billion program Ghost Fleet. Gave me $0 for it. It was the one.
Hopefully you fixed that in your contract for this book.
Yeah. It was the one that, heads of state were inviting to come, brief. The entree point was the novel to share the real world lessons of it. So in Burn-In, from the very start, we baked that into the plan. It was everything from the topic that we chose. What is the most important tech issue out there that is least understood? AI. And that's not just me saying that. 91% of leaders say it's the most important issue. 17% say, I have even a familiarity with it. And that 17% is probably lying. So you've got this massive disconnect too. Even it was something interesting that Lindsay mentioned, the scenes and even characters in it were designed to illustrate, to both entertain and inform. So that choice of the character who is the husband of the main character, to make him a contract lawyer who's out of work and been automated, that was deliberate. We built a data set, classic how we would do research style. We pulled together every single report that we could find on automation impact on the economy. So everything from what is Oxford University saying to what is McKinsey and PricewaterhouseCoopers saying, what is the World Bank saying. Look those out, play those out, and then connect it to what the projections are versus the perception of it. And so the perception is, oh, well, automation, it's either, as the Secretary of the Treasury, Mnuchin, said, well, it's not going to hit for 50 to 100 years. That's his quote, 50 to 100 years. Dead wrong. Or it's just going to hit, blue collar factory workers. And actually, one great example of it hitting a different area is contract lawyers, which is a field right now, makes hundreds of thousands of dollars, and yet not distance in the future. Right now, an AI can do a better job of finding errors in an NDA and a non-disclosure agreement than current human contract lawyers can. So, we're not going to see the end of lawyers, but we will see a shrinking of it. But then what the fiction allows you to do is not just share that data, it allows you to play out, okay, what's the ripple effects of that? So for example, the ripple effect on everything from, and this is one of the things I think it feels a little more dystopian because we're all living it. What's the ripple effect on the family of someone doing distance work all the time? We weren't planning on, all of us living that, but we see it through this character, it hitting his marriage. How does it hit politics for someone to have grown up thinking they're doing everything the right way, and then the economy no longer works that way? How does it affect they see the world, how they vote, what ideologies they might support? And then, the same thing, other times it might be, we chose scenes, so we'll plot spoil a little bit here. We chose threats that we felt weren't well understood and needed to be surfaced. So a big issue for national security moving forward is the change in the internet to the Internet of Things, as we lash up, smart cities, smart cars, smart military bases, you name it. But we're also baking in all the vulnerabilities that we did with the first generation of the internet. And so the future of cyber threats is going to be more and more attacks that have physical impact and Stuxnet style, and lower barriers to entry. So here's the plot spoil, what we show is how someone using primarily digital means could create city level versions of the 10 biblical plagues. And, oh, by the way, not us dreaming it up. Here's the research endnote to show you, hey, this is a real vulnerability in the water system, in the subway system, in the whatever. And one of the things that's been, again, I think sort of the, strange dystopian elements of it is we call them burn-in book moments, where things from the book come true. Sometimes it's really cool, fun technology, the toy, the augmented reality. Other times it's something that, so right now, Israel's water systems, literally right now, are being hit by one of the things that we talked about in the book that also could be done to the Washington, D.C. water systems. But I would add the biggest dystopian thing that we, and Lindsay and I were sort of talking about this a little bit beforehand, is I knew the tech stuff would continue to come true in the timeline that we portrayed it. Right. And some of it's been accelerated by coronavirus. What I was not prepared for was the scenes inside the US of political dystopia. Yeah. There's a scene in the book, for example, where a high militarized fence has been thrown up around the White House and has an MRAP on it. It was literally at the exact perimeter that we have it in the book. Literally, the DC residents will notice the street. In real life, it was put there. There was another scene that I thought was just so dystopian. It was riot police are gathered around the base of the Lincoln Memorial. Right. There was in the, not plot spoiling, but there was a mention, and it was in the fictional scenario of police and protesters who'd been veterans clashing. And that part, that's what concerns me, is, going back to that theme of the fine line between utopian and dystopian, is that if we don't get a handle on a lot of these issues, we're going to continue to veer more towards that dystopian vision and reality.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think dystopia is a word that has been used a lot just in the last several weeks in the press, on TV. And normally when we think of a dystopia, we think of something that's far into the future. And Lindsay made the point that your book it's very ambiguous on when it is. It could be a year from now. It could be 50 years from now. It could.
We wanted to avoid the Arthur C. Clarke 2001 problem.
Exactly. Exactly. But it's if we had read this 6 months ago, it would hit differently than it's hitting today, as we're doing this all on Zoom because we can't be in person doing book events, and as we're seeing scenes from Portland of folks that look like special operators out in Afghanistan, but are actually interior ministry forces here in the United States. Yeah. And that's one question, policy issues I'd like to sort of press you on a little bit, is this kind of blurring between law enforcement and the military. You've of course written about this for years now, but kind of, you talk about this is very much a theme in the book, and particularly how technology is being used by both, and how we should be thinking about that, particularly given what we're seeing happening right now.
Yeah, it's and there's two things I think you bring up. The first is, and it's also something that Lindsay brought up, is the timeline of it. One of the effects of the pandemic is that the trends that were in motion, that inform the book, that we in turn wanted to use the book to inform others of, the underlying research, the policy point of it, they were all in motion before the pandemic hit, but they've all been drastically accelerated by it. Whether it's certain examples of technology that got rolled out more rapidly, so the example of, like, how do we figure out the timeline of it? In the opening scene, there is a wheeled delivery robot that drives down the sidewalk behind the characters are standing in front of Washington, D.C.'s Union Station. And so the fact that there is a wheeled delivery robot driving by sort of makes you think that it's futuristic.
But I see those here in my neighborhood in DC.
Yeah, it got rapid rolled out to do grocery delivery in DuPont Circle, or the issues of surveillance and AI that Lindsay brought up, and the fine line between tracking but privacy. That's been accelerated. I mean, et cetera. So, and the tensions. So that's the first point, is that essentially the trends that we laid out, that we then use the dilemmas that the characters face, they also mean they're going to play out more rapidly in the real world. So, if there was to put a timeline on, the timeline kind of got accelerated both in the application and the good. The broader issue, and I've been sort of everybody's been pulling back and thinking about their work at an individual level, but I'm sure you're doing this in your leader role at GMF, of like organizations and how we think about it. And as I've been self-reflecting on the past two book projects that I've looked at, is that both of them were also secret veggies in the smoothie to our national security community. So the last one looked at the weaponization of social media. This one, looks at everything from AI to, it has examples looking at domestic extremism, particularly far-right extremism. Basically, they are books that a lot of people looked at, and because of my background, as, oh, it's a national security, it's a defense topic, you're a defense writer. And yet there are issues that are showing how the borders of everything from the threat to how we need to respond to it, to our fields themselves, there's not that distinction anymore between foreign policy, defense policy, and domestic, again, be it threats, be it responses. You see that blurring at everything from, if we're talking about disinformation campaigns going after democracy, it's blending foreign and domestic actors, and the responses need to be both public, private, domestic, and ideally allied, rather than treating every one of these examples as bilateral. The same thing in the blurring of lines between military, law enforcement, paramilitary. We could go on and on in this. It's basically when we're talking about AI. Is AI an issue for the military, the arms race of AI? It's also an issue. So it's an issue for the future of war. It's also an issue for the future of work. And if you don't have an understanding of each of these, you're going to miss it. And so it's kind of it's a way for our own community to understand that the stovepipes that we've used to think about issues, as well as the policies that we push for them, are missing it. And I'm trying to use a sneaky backdoor way of here we are, we're talking about German Marshall Fund, and yet we're talking about a novel. And in our discussion, we've hit on everything from externally facing stuff to talking about domestic policing, far-right extremism, future of work, you name it. And so that's the challenge set. And I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it would be underselling the book to say it's a book about national security, because it's really much broader than that. And Lindsay, I'd like to bring you back into the conversation, and get your perspective on, again, someone who thinks all the time about these issues and the policy questions around them. After reading this book, what were a handful of the things that you thought to yourself, okay, we really need to figure this out? And this is sort of teeing you up a little bit for what you mentioned earlier about the ideas for the sequel. I mean, you come away reading this book, and dystopia is the word. It leaves you feeling, if it's possible to feel worse about the future right now, this book will help you feel a little worse about the future. I don't mean to say that you shouldn't read it, but it's it's hard to find silver linings. Although, and I will be, Peter, interested in your take on this as well. Obviously, where you see the hopeful side of this. But Lindsay, what is it? I mean, part of this is meant to be a wake up call. This book is meant to put people in the mindset of the future, whether it's a year or 50 years from now. and with an idea that we can still fix it. We can still get it right. We can still try to ameliorate some of the more negative effects that are part of the plot of this book. Lindsay, what struck you there in terms of a policy agenda coming out of this book?
Yeah, and I mean, I really couldn't agree more on that. It's certainly a very sort of, very dystopian, very depressing take on a lot of these issues. And I say that, but I'm really no stranger to those sorts of talks and comments. As someone who's been told after giving presentations, wow, I feel a lot more depressed after that. Good job, but now I'm, not in a more positive place after hearing you talk. I'm always like, okay, thanks. So I mean, I think there is value in sort of that wake up call. I think something that could be addressed in a sequel or in other works would be sort of pulling on some of the threads of the positive aspects of these technologies, which I don't think, we saw very few glimmers of hope. And I think there are some in this potentially depressing future that we're headed to. I mean, just one example from our conversation earlier on the legal automation side of it and automating out contract law. There are positive sides to that too. For example, the government lawyers, anyone who's worked, especially in the executive branch, will tell you that they're massively overrun with FOIA requests, the Freedom of Information Act requests, and they spend hours upon hours redacting sensitive information from government documents so that they can be transparent to the public about what the executive branch largely is doing. And it's a massive drain on lawyer time that really could be spent developing new policy initiatives or providing more relevant legal advice. So I think, there are some positives here. Sort of the example I mentioned earlier of technology that would actually alert you to changes in the privacy policies. And I think that's also something that's not too far off in Europe and now in California with the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. There actually, are signs of industry startups trying to help automate the provision of information to consumers on where their data is going. So I think there are some real positive uses. And so when we're talking about a policy agenda, I think it's really about incentivizing and investing in some of those positive uses. And also, thinking, drawing sort of on Peter's last point about how everything seems blurred now, domestic policy, national security, foreign policy, it's really hard to figure out those lines. And I would add to that technology in terms of whether it's dual use. We used to have this conception of dual use that was very narrow. It was usually nuclear and chem and bio weapons. They could be used for civilian applications like a nuclear reactor for power, and they can be used for dangerous military applications like the development of nuclear weapons. But there were very clear technical signatures on one or the other, and actors that we were very aware and have been very aware of where those developments were happening. I think now, with the rise of AI and surveillance technologies, this distinction has blurred in a way that makes the blurring of the domestic and foreign policy all the more salient. The same commercial technologies that can be used to amass all this information in a positive way can also be used and is being used to commit human rights abuses, track down dissidents and journalists in some of our more authoritarian places in the world. And so I was on a conversation the other day about digital development and how we should be thinking about our development agenda in this kind of new technology age. And I think one of the problems that always comes up is we want to contest sort of China's digital authoritarianism. We want to provide an alternative model for what positive technology looks like, but especially in the United States, and to democracies more broadly, I think we're struggling to figure out on these issues like data privacy, on algorithmic accountability, on how much power algorithms should have in making decisions and how much that should really rely on humans, where that balance is. We're struggling as democracies to figure out what a democratic vision really looks like. What does a democratic smart city architecture look like? It probably doesn't look like the predictive policing that's sort of alluded to in the book, but on the other hand, there are certain functionalities that this technology brings to many countries, and especially, frankly, in the developing world, that serve real use cases. So I think it's never been sort of more important to get our own house in order in that regard. And I think, one of the things that the book does so much that I would have liked to see, or would like to see potentially in a sequel, is that it was very DC centric. I think it was mostly set in the DC region.
Yep.
And I was deeply curious to know, especially I think it starts to attribute this dystopia really to an unchecked private sector, if I'm not reading too much into the text of the book. And I really wonder, in this vision, is this something that's really American? Is this about all democracies? What does this future look like in Europe? What does this look like in China? What does this look like in places like Brazil or Vietnam or India? And are we seeing it? Are we going to see a divergence of paths between countries and regions that choose to regulate more versus countries that really push the technological development absent regulation? And I think we might be starting to see some of this split, in addition to with the coronavirus pandemic, between the United States and Europe on these topics, which, sort of to put it in the context of GMF's work, I think a lot of us feel that having a little more closeness with sort of our democratic allies and partners on the other side of the Atlantic is really important when it comes to countering this authoritarianism. I think, it was surprising to me that sort of the external foreign aspect of this did not get too much play. I think it was probably in the latter third of the book that we saw that Alibaba was actually still in existence and people were buying. So it was sort of like, I think maybe the one reference to China that I saw. And I think that's really an important piece of this, because we do have to worry deeply about how these technologies are being used in our own society and in democratic societies. I think, unfortunately, we're also getting the authoritarian push to really spread these technologies around the world in a way that doesn't respect human rights, that doesn't respect civil liberties, and really will actually push us into this depressing future that the book portrays. And I think what's interesting about that is that it does harness that sort of authoritarian dystopia, actually finds a way to harness the positive uses and bring sort of these negative uses alongside the positive uses. And so I think when we're talking about a policy agenda, it's really about separating out the positive from the negative and make sure we are still pushing the positive. Because I mean, it's my view that I don't think we can have a solution that just says, let's get rid of all AI. This stuff is going to violate human rights. And it may. Someone else is going to do it. Someone else is doing it. So we need to figure out a way to draw the lines and do it in a way that accords with our values. It's a tough battle, but I don't think an impossible one.
Lindsay, that's a really, really smart comment and questions. And I'd like to get, Peter, your response on this, because it certainly, reading this book made me think of how, in this moment, I've personally been appreciating the benefits of technology, that we're able to continue to do our work and do events like this because of Zoom. I've been able to at least give my children some semblance of an education with technology and get groceries delivered remotely. Imagining what this pandemic would have been like had it been 10 years ago, 20 years ago, it would have been a lot more difficult in many ways. But at the same time, as you said, sort of like seeing how then more nefarious use of the technology can get snuck in. In a similar way that this book is trying to, give us a little sugar with the medicine. The negative side of technology comes with, as we're enjoying the benefits and rushing to use it, we're not thinking through in any way, just as citizens or certainly as policymakers, what its uses may end up being. So, Peter, first, I'd love to get your impression or your response to anything that Lindsay said, but particularly this idea of how would the book play out if the plot was in Beijing or Hanoi or Berlin or London, or even Kansas City, and how kind of the broader lessons here.
Yeah, so I'm going to let you all in on a little secret. all creators of dystopian worlds are secretly optimists. And it's partly why they do it. And my co-author August has talked about this really eloquently. We peer into the darkness, but what we do is create stories that are not meant as acts of mere entertainment or even prediction, but there's an aspect of prevention to it, that you are pointing out things that could happen, or a scenario in the hope that it doesn't happen. And then secondly, and it's interesting, I was having a conversation with Veronica Roth, who creates the Divergent series, a lot of, and we're talking about the popularity in particular, not just among adults, but among teenagers, of various books set in dystopian worlds. Her Divergent series, Hunger Games, even Harry Potter is pretty dystopian at moments. And there's another element to it, is that every dystopian set story, it has agency at the center of it, and it's a story of perseverance by the main character. So agency, they make decisions that affect change, and they persevere through the bad. And so that's why I think, in particular, it's one of these broader lessons to pull, is we're in the midst of what feels like certain dystopian elements of it. These are the underlying dystopian elements in our world, pandemic-like, is that aspect of perseverance. And that's why we're seeing a surge in popularity of this genre right now. The sales for dystopian set books are doing really well, when you would think people would want to not peer into the void. But so it goes back to this act of, okay, how do we avoid the bad versus get the good? And this connects to your question, and what Lindsay brought up is, yes, the book is set in Washington, D.C., but also areas around it. And what we are doing, and there's a couple novels that do this, is that you basically follow the characters on a tour, and you get to see different aspects of life as they go through. So they go everywhere from a government building, a train station, a Starbucks, a high-end neighborhood, a low-end neighborhood. They also go out into the exurbs and farmland. So we get to see how is this playing out in different, how is it playing out for someone who works in agriculture versus how does it play out in your condo, someone who's sort of upper middle class. So there are elements of it, I think, that would play, while it's set in Washington, D.C., they would be much the same in almost any Western set city. It could be in and there's differences, of course, in the same way. And Amsterdam is different from Washington, but the idea of, you're going to have augmented reality that's popping ads at you, that, going back to this idea of the nexus between utopian and dystopian, it's going to give you so much cool things. I'm going to be walking, and there's going to be an ad for, hey, you look like you need a latte, and your favorite latte's waiting for you with the flavors that you want, and it's 30% off if you just go 20 meters over here. And you're like, I did want a latte. And then you go, hold it. Did I really want a latte? How do they know that I'm here? And that's just a commercial application, right? But the point is, I think there are certain elements that could play out anywhere except Beijing. Or more broadly, and that hits to the policy side of this. Going back to what Lindsay brought, is that let's say here are 4 policy lessons that we can do to steer it from the dystopian towards the utopian. The first is, there are, in effect, 2 different visions of the application of AI, automation, Internet of Things into our world, which is really about 2 different economic/political models that loom. And one is sort of the Chinese Communist Party, highly centralized, enforced data sharing, no privacy, and at the end of the day, it's about public control. It's about for the state. And you see that with just mass monitoring and social credit system, you name it. At the other end is our cacophony of a mix of public, private, corporate, where there still is a mass monitoring, but it's sort of more profit driven versus public security driven. And to Lindsay's point, we have to figure out what is our model that gets, accentuates the positives, eliminates the negatives, preserves privacy, gets the positives. And it's not just about how does it work out here at home. It's also about which model prevails, whether it is in a Serbia, a Hungary, a Venezuela, a Vietnam, a Nigeria, all of which are debating, in essence, which model to go with. And that wraps up in discussions of not just your vision of AI to what 5G do you buy or not, all those things. So one is you need a vision, you need a strategy to execute on it. We do not have that right now. And in fact, we do certain elements that are contrary to what would be a good strategy. So, we see this right now, strategy is multi-dimensional, right? So our immigration policy right now is literally designed to make America fail at being competitive at AI. It's the exact, and even though it's like, we want to compete with China and yet we're doing everything possible to drive away talent. Okay. So one, I need a strategy. Two, I mentioned Internet of Things threats. We are making all of the mistakes of cybersecurity that we did with the last several generations, and we're doing it right now. And we're going to have to change that and have a new kind of public-private approach to internet security that, frankly, is going to need more requirements versus the sort of let the market sort it out. Because guess what? We're going to start seeing people die if we don't get it right. Third, education. Every time you get industrial change, you have new skill sets that are needed. And the education skill set, we need, there's a need to understand AI, automation, new job skills, everywhere from how we think about our education system for our kids to people like you and I. Just like 15, 20 years ago, whether you're working in foreign policy or trade or whatever, you had to start to understand things like computing and digital issues and cybersecurity. I'm not a cybersecurity specialist, but I keep talking about it in trade talks with someone else. I'm not a cybersecurity specialist, but it keeps coming up in military doctrine. The same thing now, we need to update how the skill sets that we have all the way up to policymaker level. And then the fourth is on the private sector side, we need to start doing burn-ins of what we're deploying. And that means we need to start testing the tech and the policies from multiple different angles before we roll it out and allow it to fail catastrophically. So whether it is rolling out face recognition or driverless cars or whatever, we need to look at that proposal, that tech, from multiple different vantage points, including not just the different layers in society and diversity in that way, but also what are bad actors going to do to try and take advantage of it. And that will, and as part of this, and I would end on this, and I think relevant to the group that you've gathered, the United States in doing a burn-in is not just about learning from kind of the testing of different angles. It's also about learning from others' experiences. And I would argue whether it's, we see this right now with pandemics to cybersecurity, to how we protect our elections. One of the biggest failings of the US right now that we've got to figure out how to fix is how do we learn from other nations and their experiences as opposed to going around and telling everyone that the way we do it is the best, because we now know it ain't the best. If we had copied what other nations had done in whether it's election security or pandemic or moving forward, how to deal with AI, privacy, we as the US would be a heck of a lot better off.
Well, it's a great point. A little humility goes a long way for sure. But just on that very last point, and Lindsay, I want to bring you into this as well. What countries are getting it right or closest to right in your estimation? And let's take, even though it's grossly oversimplifying, AI. Who do you think is leading on that, if anyone? Lindsay, start with you.
So yeah, I think part of the trouble is, what is leading? Certainly technologically, the United States and China really are the leaders, especially in technological deployment. But actually, Europe as a bloc is actually quite an AI leader in terms of research output. less so in terms of commercializing that research. I think, some of our immigration policies, as Peter mentioned, are going to really, end up shooting ourselves in the foot when it comes to our future leadership on AI. But I think, in general, in terms of countries that are doing right, a couple of examples, something that was brought to my attention recently is that Finland, which, I wouldn't say is necessarily today the AI powerhouse of the world, but they have a national goal to have 1% of their population take this AI course, just sort of a rudimentary AI course to understand artificial intelligence and provide this fundamentals, recognizing that AI is going to impact all of society. So we'll have the lawyers and the farmers taking this course. So I think that, as just one example, is a really forward-leaning step that a government can take to increase the knowledge base and sort of lift everyone up as a society together. On some of the other questions that are not so much about AI competitiveness per se, but on the uses of it and in particular responding kind of to foreign threats, especially in the cyber domain. Something that was raised earlier and on the critical infrastructure domain, I think was interesting because the fact that we could have these cyber attacks on critical infrastructure is extremely timely. Just on Tuesday, the UK-Russia report came out analyzing sort of Russian interference in the UK on a number of dimensions: financial, information, disinformation, political, and also cyber. And one of the things they identified was that the UK, like many developed countries, actually has been infiltrated and penetrated by Russian cyber actors in a number of sectors. So I think, recognizing that is an important step. And then lastly, I think, one country that I think has really hit it out of the park when it comes to addressing foreign interference in a smart and principled way is really Australia. And in particular, what I've studied on them is how we balance sort of academic freedom and the threat of espionage. And I think they've done a really thoughtful look at that. Especially in the context of China. And I think their example is one that's informed by a deep understanding of the threats, not wanting to paper over some of the challenges and the problems, but retaining also a staunch commitment to democratic values. So I think in a number of areas, in terms of how these technologies are playing out, in terms of our competitiveness and our sort of sanctity as democracies, Australia has really, really led in an understated way on these issues.
Peter, does that sound right to you in terms of the countries that you look to that seem to be getting it right?
Yes, and I think what strikes most correct is the idea that there's multiple different countries doing multiple, as you would expect on this broad topic. And what you ideally do if you are a smart country is that you pick and choose from them what works best. And oh, by the way, what is applicable or not within each nation's context, right? And so you've got differences in scale, or you've got differences of systems, what can happen in a parliamentary system or not. But basically, another one that I would add in there is Estonia. Estonia, everything from a really successful digital economy to the way they've reoriented their national security, and particularly intelligence community, around different types of threats. Look, if anyone understands the threat of Russian tanks rolling over you, it's the Baltics. And yet they've changed how they think about threat, and now they both identify it, how they share information about it, to incorporate everything from the little green men scenario to, more importantly, cyber and disinformation. That's what I call like war. And they've created, new organizations around it. We don't have a parallel. For example, I think here's a micro example. Estonia has something called the Cyber Defense League, which is basically, it's not a national, like a National Guard or Reserve. It's more the parallel in the US system to the Civil Air Patrol or the Coast Guard Auxiliary. We have this type of organization for the maritime domain and the air domain, where people can, it's a lash up between public and private sector, We've got it for air and sea. We don't have it for cyber in the US. Why is that? And yet, you know, it's an example of something you might pull. Canada has done some really great things on election disinformation protection that we're not doing right now. So again, ideally what you do is you pick and choose. Look, I think a major question for us as Americans is, do we have not just the, you know, you mentioned it, kind of the arrogance, the attitude, and you know, you sort of see among the many other splits in the US is a mentality of either one that is still brash, arrogant, claiming we're the best at everything, and the other one that is humbled. I think that's a divergent worldview, and we'll see, you know, which one enters, for example, US foreign policy, but also domestic policy post-November. But there's also, do you have the mechanisms to collect lessons from other states and implement them? And that is something that I'm not sure, you know, so there's this idea of there's lessons learned versus lessons implemented. Sure. That's something in our US system I think we're going to have to think really deeply about. Oh, by the way, it's something we have at our federal level. We're watching right now, right? We know certain state, you know, it's not just different nations did better at coronavirus than others, or different states do better at supporting AI and computer science education and drawing in business. We have the little, you know, what the founders called the laboratories of democracy. For whatever reason in our system right now, we're not learning from the little labs. We're not going, oh, this state did it best, let's all go do what they're doing. Or, oh, that policy was a catastrophic failure for this state, everyone don't do what they did. Right. We're like, you know, not implementing lessons. And I think that's a broad policy issue that's going to have to be thought through in the US. But again, if we think about the transatlantic alliance, how do we build those mechanisms into our alliance structures of, okay, this, whether it's, you know, this counter to disinformation, or this approach to privacy, or this approach to engendering positive uses of AI was really successful in this member state. How can the overall alliance implement? So far in the past, it's been, you know, more so, hey, this is the US policy on it. This is the US military doctrine. Let's all adjust. We're gonna have to change that in our thinking. Yeah,
that's a really great point, and it's a good thought to end on. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but both changing our mindset as well as the mechanisms by which we prepare for the future is one of the things that you can't read this book and not come away with that impression. And so, Peter, I want to thank you and August Cole for writing this book. Lindsay, I want to thank you for your comments and the questions and challenges you offered. And I want to thank all of our listeners. Now, the one thing we can't replicate in this new virtual world that we've been living in for the past several months is the book signing. And normally this would be the time of the program where we would line folks up, and Peter, you'd be able to sign books. But what I would encourage everyone to do is go online and buy it. I'd buy it from an independent bookseller if you can. And it's a terrific read. It is a thriller. It's a action-driven plot. So it is a beach read, but it's one that's going to really make you think hard about the future and the present, as we've been discussing here this morning. So again, I want to thank all of you for joining us. Thank Lindsay for her comments, and Peter, thank you most of all for writing the book and for being with us here today. Thanks a lot. Everyone, be safe and have a good rest of the day. Bye-bye.